So let's move now to our debate, because we want to talk about how to ensure both a strong and green recovery. Let me introduce our three panelists who are joining us for our discussion. First of all, Colin Couchman, who is from IHS Markit Automotive. He's a market analyst and he leads the global light vehicle sales forecasting group. Hello to you, Colin. Great to see you.
Kathy, delighted to be here.
We also have Henrik Henriksson, who is CEO and president of Scania Group. A lot of you are very familiar with him. ACEA Commercial Vehicle Board Chairman. Hello, Henrik.
Hello.
Where are you at the moment?
I'm in Sweden at the moment, so happy to join in from the north of the wall.
Great to see you. And also, we're delighted to have with us Diederik Samsom, who is Chef de Cabinet for First Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Hello to you, Diederik.
Good afternoon.
Are you in the Netherlands? Are you in Brussels? Where are you?
Well, as you can see here, that one, it's in Brussels, obviously. Yeah, we still have work in the Bellemont building, although in diminished teams, trying to cope with the raging COVID-19 infections in Brussels.
I thought maybe you took your flag with you everywhere you went, no, but it looks wonderful. So let me first of all start with Colin Couchman, because we heard Michael Manley there, who was talking about COVID being the single worst risk that the industry has faced. But then we actually saw our poll with people watching who actually said that it was more the CO2 challenges. What's your take on it as an analyst? Where do you see the biggest risk?
Yeah, I mean, CO2 is an interesting one. Obviously, CO2 we sort of knew about. The COVID crisis is clearly a sort of black swan event. You couldn't really predict it. You could game theory, I guess, a few years ago. But no one could ever imagine the scale and speed and the sort of global spread of the virus and the sort of automatic impacts via the lockdowns and everything. And obviously, what we're really worried about now is these secondary impacts, as alluded to by Michael there, that the economies of the world face this unprecedented period of uncertainty. One of the big things we're particularly worried about is obviously these flare-ups or additional second wave in some instances, and what's required in terms of restrictions in order to combat those, and obviously ultimately dampen down the spread of the virus in order to protect healthcare systems and all the rest of it. And clearly there's a lot of work to be done there. And obviously the big risk and the huge risk, I guess, to the coming prosperity for the recovery period in particular is the move to a vaccine or additional treatments that prove effective in the coming months. And that's the big concern.
But where then do you see the biggest risk from COVID to the auto market? I mean, what specifically?
Well, specifically would be the threat of extra restrictions, which would then engender further economic damage. I mean, one of the things, Michael talked a few numbers there, that's in line certainly with our thinking. But I mean, for this year, we could cope with a sort of short-term interruption in terms of a V-shaped recovery in the classic way of looking at an instant recession. But the longer it drags on and the longer the restrictions are in play to try and combat the virus, obviously the greater and greater the economic damage is done to certainly particular sectors of the economy.
Okay, well, let me bring Henrik Henriksson in from Scania. We've heard from Michael Manley about some alarming figures, certainly in the car sector. But what about on the truck side of things? Can you just give a sort of sense of how you would characterize the current situation in your side of things?
Yeah, obviously on the heavy truck and bus industry, it was a similar situation as on the passenger car, but it was a massive impact, I would say. We had to stop all our production, the whole industry in Europe and actually globally, our operations. And I think in Europe we have the leading sort of companies that is sort of controlling the global market, you can say. So not only Europe was affected, but our whole sort of global operation. It took us a couple of weeks then to get started again. But I think at the same time then we lost a lot of momentum. And if we look at the registrations then between January and August this year, it's actually down around 35% compared to the previous year. And so I mean, this is basically unheard of. We have to go back to the financial crisis, but then it was a little bit different back then. So Of course, it has a big impact on us as OEM manufacturers, but even more painful, I would say, are small and medium-sized customers that has been suffering tremendously during this time, which lead them to they have difficulties to keep their business running, and they have returned quite a big number of vehicles then, because most of the sales we are doing on the heavy commercial vehicles is like operation and lease contract of 4 to 5 years. So there's been a big flood of vehicles, return vehicles coming into us. But then I would say that the situation stabilized during the summer, and I think the resilience in the order book for most of us was quite okay, and the order intake started to look a little bit more positive. But then, unfortunately, now the last couple of weeks, we are seeing then the risk of a second wave in Europe have an effect. And just giving an example from my daily work then at Scania, I think at the moment we have some 125 red listed suppliers, which means that they have difficulties to provide us with parts for the coming weeks because of national rules of potential close downs, and also that quite a number of people are still in quarantine and cannot sort of work in the factories. So I think we will have disturbances now the coming weeks in our industry for sure. Yeah, sorry.
Let me just bring in, sorry to interrupt you there, let me just bring in Diederik Samsom from the Commission. I mean, these are not good stories we're hearing. 125 red listed suppliers that Henrik Henriksson referred to there. How important is it from the Commission perspective to help the auto industry overall rebound in obviously a competitive but a green way?
Well, it's essential. It's essential to get our economy back on track. And well, as you outlined before in that nice little promo movie, the car industry is a large part of that economy. And the first thing we need to do is help member states get the virus under control and the spread of it under control, because as long as that's not happening, the recovery will not take off. And as soon as we can start with the recovery, indeed, we have applied the pretty simple self-evident logic that if we rebuild the economy, we better immediately build back better instead of building up the old stuff and then trying to make the transition. So we're going to use this, if you may say, opportunity to speed up the transition that was already ongoing in large parts of the economy, including the car industry, as Mark already outlined. The transition was already started, and what we would like to do together with the car industry is increase the speed of that in order to enable the recovery and fuel the recovery towards more jobs and growth.
Thank you. Maybe Henrik, you'd like to come back in here, and we're here there about this as an opportunity to speed up transition. From your perspective, the green side of the recovery to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, is it still relevant? Is it still achievable?
Oh yes, it's very relevant, and I think we welcome the clarity from Diederik and his team, and we of course sign up on this journey as well. We as an industry, by 2050, the latest, we should be able to provide a carbon neutral sort of a freight system for not only Europe but for the whole world, so we are definitely part of that the plan, and we see that the green recovery will be the way to rebuild a strong European industry, and both for us and for our supplier structure, but also then for our customers. So but we need a couple of things that we need to align on, but I feel being part of the same meetings as Diederik Samson a few times now, I feel that there is we are working much better now together, hand in hand. It's not like a ping pong game. We're actually sitting down together and trying to come up with a joint plan. And I think that requires on the heavy side big investments now quickly in charging infrastructure for electrical vehicles, so that we can go from the fossil diesel vehicles into electrical vehicles, while at the same time we try to speed up also the production of biofuels that can replace older vehicles that are already out on the road running today, because we keep our vehicles for 10-15 years. And then at the same time, I think there is also potential then for hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. But I think we have to take this in the right order. And now all the manufacturers are ready with lineups of not only small trucks, but also big trucks that can run on electrification. But then we need to charge them, and then we need to build up not charging poles as such. That is the easy one, but it's the basic grid actually in all countries in Europe that is missing. And those are quite long lead times on these things. But that's been identified by the Commission, and I think we need to get it through with the member states now. Then we have a plan, and then it will fly.
Let me bring Diederik back in on this then, because the charging infrastructure, this is something that has been talked about for so long, the need for a more extensive infrastructure, and it seems to be so slow. What is going to, you say that it's an opportunity to speed up the transition. What's going to happen then?
Well, about the slowness of it, I would almost say be careful what you wish for, because all of a sudden it can go very fast. In some parts of Europe, it is already going very fast. The Netherlands, Norway, which is not part of the EU, but I like to connect it to the rest of Europe. They like to be the same. You can see that incredibly fast. But you're right. Our goal, which simply put is to have every family, giving them the opportunity to drive across Europe without having to wonder whether they will whether we will get to the next charging station. That is not met yet, especially in large parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. So we need to speed up that.
But when you say we need to, sorry to interrupt, but when you say we need to speed up, well, in terms of statistics, I think you've talked about 1 million charging stations, but that's not enough, is it? I mean, are you going to be able to put a higher figure, and funding behind it?
Well, the funding behind it, obviously, it depends a little on how you define those million. We're not going to count all the charging points within the built environment. It's the let's say essential ones along the highways that meet that challenge of having every family driving across Europe without being anxious about getting the next charging station. So I think, well, as we have calculated, we are well on the way with the, if we would implement 1 million. Speeding up is now possible, and I'm referring back to the opportunity, since we now have not only the Green Deal and its ambitions, but also Next Generation EU, which is the 750 billion recovery package that the EU put on the table, and that we're currently negotiating with Council and Parliament in order to get that up and running. And part of that is obviously this challenge. We have defined specific flagships within the Next Generation EU package, hydrogen being one of them, the built environment, insulating our homes, etc., but also charging stations and renewing our fleet is part of that flagship approach. And we already see with the first recovery plans from member states or draft recovery plans coming in, we can already see that they buy into this idea of indeed all investing all in charging stations. So Portugal, France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, they all play their role, and together we will have that pan-European network of charging stations that is needed to get the electrical mobility.
But do you not need to actually install some binding targets if it's ever going to really happen?
Well, we are. I'm not sure whether the car industry likes them, but for instance, on the emission standards for cars, we are going to.
But targets in terms of charging stations?
Yeah, we have ourselves, that's an aspirational target, 1 million. We don't have the ability in a confederation as the EU to force member states to put up a certain amount of them. But we've taken a different approach, and we do that more often, so we have some practice in that. 27 recovery plans together will meld into one common European project. And one aspect of that common European project is a common European charging network that covers the European area.
Maybe I could bring Colin back into the conversation and just ask you, what do you think could happen at European level that could really give the support that the industry is needed? Would you say that the charging network is one of the key things, or what would you think is one of the biggest things that's going to stimulate the market?
It's a good question. So, I mean, if we remember what happened in 2008 and 9, when we had, pretty big, aggressive global recession, things, I guess, sort of from a global level, weren't as bad then as they are now. In that there were some pockets of growth in the world which we haven't really got this time in the same way. So China was to a certain extent insulated then. Maybe it is a little bit now because they seem to have got the virus under control. But clearly, the challenges are everywhere across the world. Double-digit demand falls and all the rest of it, and the knock-on effects into the economies. So, I mean, actually, from an autos point of view, we were always expecting that the European Commission would actually consider cutting the industry a bit of a break in terms of the CO2 mandate and some of the targets, and that just really didn't happen at all. So some of these challenging numbers for this year and next year in terms of reduction in CO2 actually come on top of COVID with Brexit and the rest of it. It's intensifying the challenge for the European car makers in a very, very big way, and some of them are really, really going to struggle with this. This is actually a big part of our business. We've got a whole department of people working on compliance and the ramifications of emissions compliance. And we're scratching our heads over what this means in terms of volume and the market mix. And obviously, if we remember back to 2008-9, the governments came in with some pretty generous incentives, so scrappage incentives, which did have an eco and safety component at the time. Been ruled out this time round for some of these eco reasons. So some of the incentives in play are pretty limited, really. They're quite generous sometimes, but they're a bit limited in terms of their impact because to a certain extent they're going to incentivize vehicles that have already been ordered. So they're not really adding much in terms of additional demand. And also, this concern what happens when the incentives are withdrawn. They just vanish and everything's back to where it was. So we do have some pretty significant concerns over this path to lower emission mobility.
And you're talking about national schemes. What about more action at European level? What do you think would be possible?
Well, as has been alluded to, the European Union's hands are not tied, but the options are limited, let's say, from the European level. And I guess, this is to be expected, and people vote for governments and governments set policy and all the rest of it, and everyone understands that. I think there are some things that can be done in the short term. The toolbox of incentives could be opened up for things like micromobility. There's lots going on anyway around this, cycling, active travel, they call it, walking, e-bikes, e-mobility, scooters, maybe some mandates towards electrifying other modes of transport and mopeds and scooters and things like that might be an easy win. The other one is, maybe some movements towards e-cargo, so emphasizing delivery side of things, maybe tuning into car usage rather than ownership. So maybe green taxi fleets, that's a quick one if you get that in there. And then obviously, the power generation side of it is a big question. And whenever we talk about the electrification, we see these big numbers for the future. But obviously, everyone's first question is, where does the electricity come from? Both in terms of the generation of the electricity, so it should really be renewable for any sort of car charging application, but also, what happens in terms of power generation investment, which is a massive area. This is number one polluter in terms of sectors, transport's number two. And clearly, many countries in Europe are miles and miles behind in terms of greening their electricity generation. So from an autos point of view, you look over your shoulder and think, what about those guys?
Okay, maybe Henrik, you would like to come back in here, and because we talk about how big the CO2 challenge is, and you've talked about charging stations, but many other elements that really could make your life simpler that I'm sure that you would like to mention. What would be top of your shopping list?
No, but I think it's nice and fine that we talk a lot about the passenger cars, because mobility of people, of course, is important in Europe. But if we seriously look at where the CO2 emissions comes within the European sort of system, of course, a lot of it is coming from freight transport, and freight transport in Europe is not only train. A lot of it is made on the trucks along the highways. And of course, to address that, we need to, as Colin is into, first of all, we need to make sure that we produce then renewable energy. And I think we sometimes tend to forget about the big long term. So what I would like to see is a much more focus on sustainably produced biofuels that we can put into the fuel tanks of the fossil diesel vehicles today. Then we can reduce CO2 with 90% on the rolling fleet of population, and that will have an immediate impact on CO2 for real, and not just talking about the future. But then we need to do also on the electrification side, and we need to have renewable energy production like Colin was into, make sure that that gets started. It's not happening in all countries, I can agree with that. But then I think that we are all underestimating. We think that these big lorries and trucks, that they need just the sort of same kind of cable as the passenger cars. It's not like that. We need a completely different infrastructure to charge. We need up to 1 megawatt to charge the trucks along the highways, because we need to charge them within 45 minutes, because that's the resting time of our drivers before they can drive another 4 hours on the road. And our customers or business organizations, they will not transform to the electrified vehicles if they cannot run their business in a profitable way. And that's where we need this basic infrastructure to create the foundation for a transformation. So I think that we are underestimating in most of the countries the time it will take for us to build out this additional infrastructure for getting the effect at the right place where we actually need it, at our customers' depots and along the highways. So that is what I would like to sort of get sort of help with. And I think that, yes, there's only so much we can do from a European perspective. We need to solve this on a country level. I agree. But one thing that maybe is a little bit a surprise coming from the ACEA organization is that we are actually promoting that we want to have a proper price on carbon. We need to put the proper price of what carbon actually costs. And that is not truly reflected in the way it is now. There we could get the European sort of coordination. There we could get help to align ourselves. And that would be a huge benefit for the whole value chain, those who buy the transport, those who conduct the transport, those who build the energy and fuels and the vehicles. All of us, we would quicker transform them. So that would be also top of the wish list.
A lot on your wish list, and Diederik Samsom, I don't know whether you've got a magic wand there. You could actually make all this happen overnight. But I think what really was coming out very clearly from Henrik was that it's this sense of urgency that he worries about. The fact that the world is underestimating the urgency of the situation, and so many things that need to be done that could actually help the situation now instead of in several years' time. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's a lot on our plate, but actually we are thinking about it, and that's why we produced the Green Deal in December last year, before COVID entered our lives and turned the world upside down. And the Green Deal was that all-encompassing strategy in which we didn't tackle one thing at a time, hoping for one silver bullet, because there isn't one. We developed a strategy in which everything is connected with each other, including ramping up sustainable fuel production, including ramping up green electricity production, and that's all other webinars that I'm joining these days. So we're trying to do all of that simultaneously, which is actually the silver bullet in itself, trying a strategic approach this time. For instance, for the cars, I heard Colin say that indeed in the last crisis, the financial crisis, there were more generous scrapping schemes. Yes, but we've also learned from those scrapping schemes that in terms of their, let's say, effectiveness in greening the car fleet, and that wasn't too effective. So yes, we are promoting this time too car scrapping schemes, but with let's say more ambitious benchmarks. So indeed only replacing very old ones with very new ones instead of muddling in the middle of the car fleet as we did last time. So that's one thing. But I have to stress, I mean, yes, we are ramping up on our ambition instead of giving the car industry a waiver on their CO2 targets. But at the same time, there's never been so much public money available to make this happen. And there's never been so much public sense of urgency available to make this happen. So in a strange way, the COVID-19 crisis created the perfect storm in a positive sense to make this transition happen right now. And indeed, our public money and no, it's not our money, it's taxpayers' money, but taxpayers' money and our policies will have to be aligned with the investments and the ambitions of the industry. And as Henrik already said, we are trying to align that as good as we can by talking to each other, by sitting on the same table, by getting the noses into the same direction. And I'm actually pretty optimistic that that will work this time.
Because the COVID recovery plan, I mean, you've referred to the Green Deal, and that was all talked about a bit earlier, but the COVID recovery plan, it seems a little bit vague, actually, in terms of the financial means of recovery for this auto industry. Not very many specifics.
No, because that's where member states come in. So it's indeed a different, let's say, a complicated machinery that we are operating here. We have 750 billion available, partly grants, partly loans. That is dedicated for specific member states that have to deliver a plan in order to be eligible for that money. Part of that plan will be parts of what we talked about right now, setting up a charging network, incentivizing their own industry to make a jump towards zero emissions mobility, investing indeed, as Colin said, in micro mobility in urban areas or in mobility as a service. We will come out with the sustainable mobility strategy in a few months, well, in just over a month's time, in order to guide all of the 27 member states into the same direction. As I said, the European Commission or the European Union as a union is a different machine a difficult machine to operate, but I'm optimistic that we can.
Okay, Henrik, optimism there, perfect storm, more public money than ever before. Are you convinced?
No, but I mean, I have to say that I think that the direction that has been pointed out through the Green Deal, I think it gives us tremendous clarity as industry. I mean, yes, of course, we have to go through our member states then and sort of apply for the money and make sure that there is tangible projects and so on. But I think, yes, it gives a framework that we can use to accelerate this platform. And I think we as an industry on the heavy commercial side, we are also signing up on this, and we want to be part of the solution, not be sort of like a dinosaur that is stuck with an old problem. So I think we see this as a great opportunity. But of course, and we need to continue to work hand in hand, because it's not possible to do this alone for the industry. It's not possible to do this alone either in Brussels or on a national political level. Policymakers and industry need to work together in a much better way than before. And I think that we have, in a way, also learned during the COVID. We are on the same team. I think actually it looks very promising, but we need a couple of brave decisions still to actually make this happen in reality. We do.
Brave decisions. What sort of brave decisions?
No, but I think that especially, I mean, to a certain extent, now I'm like an old parrot here, coming back to the basic electricity network that I think we just recently have figured out is so poor in most of the European countries that if you want to renew that, usually the process to make such a decision, yes, to go through the policy, to do the investigation, is a handling time of usually within 6 to 7 years. Then it just takes 2 years to build it. But and in some countries it's actually 10 to 12 years. Then we need brave decisions, almost like you give our politicians in the country a much bigger mandate than they are used to actually bypass their own sort of political system that they have created. That sort of braveness we need on the political arena. When it comes to the business, I think we need to be brave when it comes to realizing that if we're not transforming our companies to become truly sustainable in both our own production, in our sourcing, and of course our products and services that we offer, if we're not doing this transformation as a company, we will soon not be relevant, because no one will buy our products or services eventually when sustainability becomes the norm, and no one will invest in our companies, and no one would like to work for us. So I think we also need to be brave and as corporate leaders to step up the game and transform not only our own companies, but have the ambition to transform our industries as well. I think that sort of braveness is asked for now, because the climate change is not waiting for us. We need to bend the curve the coming 2-3 years. Otherwise, it's too late.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's have a look at a couple of questions from the audience, because I'm sure we've got quite a few coming in. Do you see a role for e-fuels, power to fuel, for trucks? Henrik, it has to be for you. Do you see a role?
Yeah, of course, in the future, yes. But, sometimes we have a tendency as people in our industry and academia and policymakers as well. We love to talk about that potential silver bullet that might come in the future one day. And then we forget about focusing here and now. And I think that is a little bit the challenge. So I would say yes, in the future, of course. But I think what we need to focus on now on build on sort of the biofuels and the electrification. But let me say a few words, because I think this is maybe linked also to hydrogen and fuel cells discussion. And I think, yes, the same goes for those vehicles. They will come eventually. We are doing tests. All the brands in our industry is working quite well. The cost of these vehicles is way too expensive still, but maybe in the future the cost will come down. But I think we also need, from a European perspective, also to figure out if we now start building a so-called hydrogen economy in Europe, which I know is on the agenda, and I think which makes a lot of sense, because we need to distribute all this renewable energy that we produce from solar and wind. Great. But we need to also figure out which will be the industries that are hard to abate that will actually need this kind of energy first. And one of the things that I would like to see is that the steel industry, one of the biggest emitter in our industry, and when I build a truck that weighs 6.5 tons, I buy 5.5 ton steel. I would like that steel to be carbon neutral. And I think that industry should be prioritized when it comes to hydrogen, for example. So I think we need also to figure out where with these new technologies, which industry in Europe should actually be first in line to use it, who do not have an alternative like a battery or another energy source. So I think here we need a little bit of thinking and coordination as well, not only on a national level, but also actually on a European level. And I think those thoughts, I know, is in the plans of
Let me bring Diederik in on this, because I know that Frans Timmermans is sorry to interrupt. We have a bit of a problem on the line there. I know that Frans Timmermans is a great fan of hydrogen. I remember moderating an event where he was given a standing ovation when he said that hydrogen is going to have a pivotal role in the future. And so what do you make of the remarks that Henrik was making there about making decisions on where hydrogen should be used best?
Yeah, obviously Henrik is completely right here. We need hydrogen in our economy in many facets. So maybe for certainly as a raw material for industry, certainly as an energy source for parts of the industry that are hard to abate or hard to electrify, maybe also for very heavy trucking and transport, and maybe even for heating purposes, and certainly also for stabilizing our electricity grid. And that's only 5 or 6 of the implementation possibilities for hydrogen. We have laid out a hydrogen strategy in which we, as I said, prioritize a few of those uses of which we are certain that we need hydrogen for. And then obviously we are closely following innovation, developments, investments in the industry to see where it ends up. Nobody knows exactly where the cutoff weight for hydrogen in transport is. Only a few years ago, a lot of people thought that buses would be hydrogen at least. Well, we know now that most of the buses, if not all, are going to go on electricity. Then we thought that, well, light trucks might also be hydrogen driven. Well, we know that light trucks most likely will be electricity driven. So it is moving forward, and maybe Henrik is right, and hydrogen will not play a role in any of the road transport options that we have. I'm not certain whether that will be the future. Nobody is certain what the future will be. So it's our job to closely monitor and be ready for all eventualities, while at the same time ramping up hydrogen, as said, as a pivotal instrument in renewing and making our economy green.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question from the audience. So shouldn't the EU modify competition guidelines to allow the automotive sector to meet climate objectives, just like was done for renewable electricity, for example? So modifying competition guidelines. Who would like to, I mean, obviously, Diederik, you will come. I don't know whether, Colin, you've got any thoughts on that.
I don't really understand the question, actually. So maybe someone else.
I think it's basically loosening the rules on competition to help to boost the sector. I mean, Diederik, what would your thoughts be on that?
Well, if you try the analogy with renewable energy, we set mandatory standard or mandatory requirements for the amount of renewable electricity that is put into the system via European regulation, and we made it possible for governments to subsidize renewable electricity. Well, that's exactly what we are going to do and what we are already doing, but we're ramping up on our ambition on the car industry. So as of 2030, the impact assessment that we just produced a month ago tells us that in 2030, the emission standards for cars should be on a 50% lower than the 2021 standard, which is much more ambitious than the currently envisaged minus 37%. So first of all, we will ramp up the ambition there. And secondly, as I said, with the public money available in Next Generation EU and otherwise, we make it possible via state aid regulation, and we will revise the state aid regulation for energy and environmental purposes also next year. We make it possible that, let's say, taxpayers' money is used to help this transition happening.
Okay, let's take another question from the viewers. Will company cars share of new car sales drop from the current 60% as home working potentially leads to fewer face-to-face business meetings? So maybe, Colin, this is one that you would know something about in terms of the impact on the market, and company cars are a big part of the mix at the moment, maybe not in the future.
Yeah, certainly. It's a sector that's been under pressure for quite some time and long heralded the death of the company car. I mean, in the short term, some of the incentives for electrified vehicles actually quite a boost to the company car sector, because people are simply paying less tax under the provision of the rules to try and engender a bit more electrification in the system. It's actually quite a good way to do it, because you know these cars are turned over quite quickly, 24 to 48 months lease on average basis. So if you can encourage people to get an electrified car as part of their company car, that car then goes into the used market. Someone else has the benefit of that vehicle and chooses an electric car where they might not have done previously. So in some ways, you can see there's quite a benefit. Obviously, the flip side is, should we be incentivizing people at all in this way, the so-called perk car and all the rest of it? There's question marks around the relative fuel economy performance of plug-in electrified vehicles, question marks over whether people just take the tax advantage from them and they're not really using them properly. There are ways you could try and incentivize that through, possibly the fuel expenses system, or encourage them through other ways like fuel cards for electricity charging, stuff like that. So there are ways, but I think the death of the company car has been long heralded, and it's not really come to pass.
While you're there, don't go away, because I've got to ask you the Brexit question. No deal Brexit looking horribly possible. How do you see the impact on this industry?
Yeah, well, the one good thing about the COVID crisis was that everyone stopped talking about Brexit for a little while, but obviously it's back now, through to the end of the year. Lots of discussions in and around, the theatrics or the cases. Still, there will be some sort of decision, obviously, unless there isn't, right? So we still have, sort of 35%-ish chance of no deal. It's not really no deal. It's no trade agreement in the time specified. So that's what we're working on. And obviously the knock-on impact for the European economy is pretty bad. Obviously for the UK it's horrendous, but obviously not great for the rest of the European economy, especially the auto sector, which would obviously face import tariffs where haven't faced them for many, many years, since the 70s. It's back to square one in terms of that, and obviously the associated border friction, some of the parts trading across borders and manufacturing supply chains will be heavily impacted. There's many processes that happen multiple times across borders in order to make cars happen. The classic seatbelt in the Netherlands, back to the UK, and then assembled elsewhere. So there's lots of moving parts, literally, but our hope is some sort of accommodation.
Okay, well, I'm sure everybody's hoping as well. Just to finish this part of the proceedings and this debate, I just want to ask you all a final question to answer very, very quickly, but it's really just the one most important action, the way that you see it, to help propel the sector out of the crisis. What would you say, Henrik? What is, if you just had one wish, what would really make a difference and soon?
Yeah, here and now it would be to get an approval so that on a national level we will start building out the basic electrical network to cater for a transformation on the heavy side to go to electrical vehicles. So that would be my wish.
Okay, thank you. And what about you, Colin? What do you think would help the sector the most?
I've got a big list, but one or two, I guess, would be, one is vehicle affordability. I think that's a massive one, especially in the context of compliance and the challenge of CO2. It's all very well and good having these the rules and everything, but we're going to go through a very dramatic period of economic decline. Many consumers around Europe have been much poorer than they would have been, especially in particular countries and sectors. It's going to hit people, really, really hard, and so they're already going to have challenges on affordability from paying for the car. But then obviously the list price and vehicle prices have been going up with the technology load quite significantly. And this is very important because obviously affordability is a key consumer driver, and it's the one that's going to enable the industry. If you want tech loading, if you want electric cars, people have to be able to afford them, and that's a key one for us.
Thank you. And Diederik Samsom, from the Commission point of view, what do you think you could do that would have the most impact?
Well, we keep doing what we can, but what wasn't mentioned so far is our budget to innovate, to incentivize innovation. And obviously what would be, well, not the silver bullet, because again, that doesn't exist, but a very important step forward would be the invention and implementation of the next generation battery. And the EU is ramping up its investments in research and innovation to try and make that happen. But we are not the engineers, we are not the scientists in inventing things. Those are within the car industry and around. And I'm encouraging all of you to make this happen. We stand ready to support it.
And an important part of that, one assumes, is European independence for raw materials, because potentially post-COVID, we're going to see more rising protectionism around the world, perhaps?
Yeah, there's a lot of talks about it, and not for nothing. And there's also work going on. We found some lithium, luckily, somewhere in Spain and in Portugal. But obviously, in the next generation battery, we might also want to use other materials that are less rare and makes us less dependent on Chile or China. But that's only one consideration. The others is obviously having much more energy per kilogram, having much more energy per euro, and having a longer range for our consumers in our clean cars.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you to Henrik Henriksson, to Diederik Samsom, and to Colin Couchman for a great discussion. And thank you for your questions. We haven't got to them all. We never do. I'm so sorry.